I want to welcome you to tonight's discussion presentation of this story that we've been really fascinated by over the last months or more, and that is the story of this house, the story of this building. I know that we had a big exhibition opening on April 30th, where the house was packed. Probably many of you were there. We've actually had very many people coming, which is not often the case, after the exhibition opening to see this exhibition. We produced a little brochure where you have more information about the history of our building, but tonight really is the opportunity to talk to those two people that were behind this project, and I want to introduce them to you, starting with Virginia Budny. We always call her the leading expert, the leading art historian, not only on our building but on the entire area. She received an AB from Vassar College, an MFA in Studio Art from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she later taught sculpture, and an MA from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. She was the research assistant to the chair of the Department of European Paintings, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, from 1993 to 2009, and since 2003 she has been preparing a catalogue raisonné of the oeuvre of sculptor Gaston Lachaise. It's the sculptor you see when you come into the building and who made this beautiful statue that catches everybody's attention, believe me, when they come to Deutsches Haus. And also Gaston Lachaise, he worked in this house, but he was also Paul Manship's principal assistant. Paul Manship, also a sculptor who was here at Deutsches Haus. She's the author of New York's Left Bank, Art and Artists off Washington Square North from 1900 to 1950, which appeared in 2006, and its companion, New York's Left Bank, Art and Artists off Washington Square North from 1900 to 1950, which appeared this year. And I think both of these publications are on sale at the entrance. We're going to, I also would like to introduce Julia Lammer. She's the curator of the exhibition. She studies at NYU. She's a graduate student in the Visual Arts Administration program in the Department of Art and Art Profession at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education and Human Development at NYU. You hold a BA in Art History and Economics from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and has worked in several cultural organizations and various countries. And I think there is another exhibition which you curated at NYU on display right now in the Kimmel Center.
The title is The Poetics of Translation, and it's student work of BFAs and MAs, and it explores the spaces in between translation or in between transformation. But it's a very different type of exhibition.
We're going to talk about the exhibition at a later point, so this is how it's going to work tonight. First of all, Virginia is going to give us a presentation about the first 144 years of this building, and then we're going to have a chat about the exhibition, and then we're going to open up to you, because I'm sure that's maybe the most exciting part, your questions that you might have left at that point on the building. But we'll start with Virginia Budny, who's going to give us an introduction.
In providing assistance for this project, my focus has been on the early history of this building, the subject of my slide presentation today. And this is not a quiz. This is a brief introduction. I'm an art historian, as Martin had said, with a special interest in the sculptor Gaston Lachaise. And I knew that he had worked in this building first as Manship's assistant from 1917 to 1921, and later on his own account from 1933 to 1935. During that later period, he prepared for his 1935 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the first ever for an American sculptor. And I'd like to note that the sculpture in the adjacent room was featured in that exhibition. And the model for it was made in this building. My initial study of this building grew out of my desire to publicize the fact that he and other important artists, as you see here, had worked here in the first half of the last century. My interest in the inhabitants of 42 Washington Mews eventually led to my 2006 book, you see on the left, and exhibitions at La Maison Française in 2006 and the Snug Harbor Cultural Center in Staten Island in 2007. For these projects, I investigated the conversions of many buildings in this area, that is the 2 blocks just north of Washington Square, into artist studios in the first half of the 20th century, as well as the diverse, vibrant community of artists that moved in. The cover of the first volume features Nicholas Murray's photo of Manship at work in this building. I'm proud to have identified the setting and date of the photograph and to have been the first to publish it. The image has become iconic, and I'm often told is now attached to many walls and refrigerator doors around town. I'm very pleased about that. 2 weeks ago, I published a roster of more than 450 artists who lived and worked in these studios during that period. I'd like to emphasize that these artists were a very diverse group and all walks of life. And I think it is a marvelous fact that any artist who walked out of his studio would have encountered more than likely somebody who knew, had at least a general idea of what he or she was about. As Martin said, both books may be obtained at the door, but also through Anne Brockschmidt, the proprietor of Carnegie Hill Books, and you can access that online. Here are plans for the conversions of many buildings in the north half of this block in 1916. This one is about 1900, and that one is right after the conversion. And this part shows, we'll see a detail of this later, this is what became Deutsches Haus. And I'd like you to note that this part is connected with what is the townhouse. This part was built right around the same time that this part was built by 1833. The 1916 conversion dealt with raising the height of the building, joining some of the buildings together as actually tenements. Tenement buildings, but they were rented out as artist studios. And also then in the back of the Mews, those were essentially stables that had been converted then into artist studios. Picturesque features included the plaster with glaze, by the way, these are all still visible, of course, the plaster with the glazed tile, colored glazed tile decorations, window boxes, and shutters. A precedent for the 1916 conversion was the very successful, well-publicized conversion of stables in McDougal Alley into artist studios that began in about 1900. Here's one of the tenants. It's Edwin Deming, and here are his daughters. The photographs are by a very famous photographer who photographed many of the scenes around Greenwich Village. One of his daughters later on became an artist. His subject were often Native Americans, and as you can see in his studio, which is pictured right here. And as I note, the water in the center had to do with the residue left from washing down the alley every day, because many of the buildings were still used as stables. The conversion of stables in McDougal Alley was initially the result of a close collaboration of artists and the private owner, Mary Ann Chisholm, through her son, George Eddings Chisholm. So it was very possible for these artists who needed spaces to execute their large commissions, and stable spaces were ideal. So it was easy for them to collaborate with the owner, who was very willing to do something with his rundown property. In contrast, the 1916 conversion of this block was commissioned by the trustees of Sailors Snug Harbor, a philanthropic institution that owned the property. And then some 60 years later, NYU bought most of this block. And you can see the property that Snug Harbor owned since 1801. But they were not able to develop that property for a period of time because the will that gave them the property was contested. So as soon as the will was resolved, the lots were plotted, and here we are. This is the lot on which Deutsches Haus stands. I shall now address two topics. Some of the other residents of this particular block, and two, key features of the evolution of the structure and appearance of 42 Washington Mews over a span of 144 years. And to begin, I'd like to mention some of the artists who populated the south side of the Mews before the 1916 conversion. Artists had frequented the Mews since the studio building, and here it is right here, which was erected in 1844 between 3 Washington Square North and 14A on the south side of Washington Mews, because the back entrance, because the entrance of the back part of the building was on the Mews, and you can see sometimes in some photographs you can see that entrance. On the right you see painter Mary Foote, who was one of the inhabitants of the back, here she is here, of the back side of the building. And interestingly enough for me, and perhaps for you too, she left that studio to become Carl Jung's first patient and assistant disciple. And it just so happened that she recorded the 2-year seminar on the visions of Christiana Morgan, whose portrait appears in bronze outside this room. Many of you know that Hopper lived in occupied two different studios, but in this part and that part of the building. The back part originally had an extra floor, but a devastating fire in 1971 gutted the entire back of the building, and all the artists were driven out. That photograph is by a very famous photographer who lived in the tall apartment building in the next block. Another artist who occupied one of the studios on the south side of Washington Mews is Frances Grimes. This is the building in which she lived and worked for a number of years. At the time that she did, this lower part has been redone, remade. Some of the photographs that you'll see in this exhibition will show these as rectangular. This is the entrance to the back of 14A. And this is one of a pair, as you can see, of a model that she made across there. And she had these carved in a marble carving shop in the next block. And the two marbles are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It just so happens that a photographer who photographed many of the artists who lived and worked in this area, DeWitt Clinton Ward, also had his studio there for a time. He is the one who photographed this photograph. And that is Frances Grimes. It's not known which studio. It could have been in McDougal Alley when she was first in McDougal Alley. But then when another artist obtained the property, she relocated here. The last artist that I will discuss, who was on the south side of the Mews early on, was Edward Field Sanford. And if you can see this lovely photograph, I think it's a marvelous photograph, but it's hard to see here, so I would suggest that you go to through the exhibition to see the details a little bit, I believe, a little bit more clearly. But we're up right around here. We are looking from east to the west, and here is the building where Frances Grimes had made her studio, and you'll see that they're rectangular. Here's the entrance for 14A, and a little bit beyond, you just can't see it here, I'm sorry, but is going to be, you'll see a little porch that sticks out, and here's Sanford with his Great Dane, who then, of course, he sculpted, and of course, who made that photograph was DeWitt Clinton Ward, naturally. And here also, he is in his studio there. I like to think that the dog there had a friend. At any rate, he was the one who renovated the studio in 1913, and he stayed there, as I know, until 1917. A critic said that to the old building he had added a new red front, a grass green porch and fence, and window boxes that held bright geraniums. And according to that critic, its quaint appearance evoked Mother Goose Land. And I believe that that's really the best characterization there is of this area. And it just so, this northern half of the block. It just so happens that Sanford's studio was what inspired Frank's conversion in 1916 of the buildings in the north half of the block, including this one. Here is the facade, better seen in this detail, of our building. And of course then here is what it looks like today. The cartoons are in the show, and I think that they marvelously epitomize some of the changes. This one took place, this cartoon was made right at the moment that the buildings were being converted, and you can see that not very long afterward already, just as the artists replaced horses, the well-to-do began to replace. Now I'm going to briefly discuss some of the changes that have taken place. I know from the documents that I've researched that this particular that are downtown, this is the stable, and I can date that to 1933. But you can see by this map, 1854, there's a whole string of stables. This stable was made for this townhouse. By 1884, as I explained in my essay for that little brochure you can get up, this part, and I'm right around over here, wait a little bit, I'm staying probably right around there. This part was built as an extension of the townhouse, and you can see that there was an entrance connecting the two. And then here is the front, and I'd like to note that it's indicated on this map as a Chinese laundry. These are partitions, but this was built as a plate glass storefront, and we had seen some of those. Now this is a map with a superimposition in blue. That's blue. I know it's a little hard to see. Of the earlier map that I had shown you. Now what happened in 1916 was that these two buildings that I've discussed were joined. This passageway was made from University Place to gardens that were carved out of the space. These buildings were, some of these buildings were just cut away. To make several formal gardens. Now I'd like to point out that this is our building. And I'm standing probably somewhere right around here. And what you can see is at the top, this was this passageway looking to University Place. And right at the top is what is called the tower skylight. And you can see the example part of this over here, but there's also a skylight here. And then again, there was another skylight back here. These are the buildings right along here. This is 8th Street. At any rate, this is, as soon as immediately after the renovation was complete, occupancy was approved in January. And this photograph was probably done, although it was published in April, he probably moved in, and this is probably taken probably February, let's say. Anyway, Manship is standing right here, and here is the illumination from this tower building back here, and I'm sort of right over here, and this then is the front. So you can see things have changed quite a bit, but still, many things are still the same. In 1932, Donald Deskey was contracted to design the interiors of Radio City Music Hall, and he's a famous designer and exceedingly famous for his work there. And in 1934, he designed the interior of 46 Washington Mews. These are in Cooper Hewitt couch. This is about a year after Prohibition. And right here is a push-button bar that would come right out of the couch here. The woman for whom he designed was one of the wealthiest women in America. And I like this bedroom. I think that's great. But at any rate, here is also the interior of the door. And you can see it here too. Over here. And actually, it's still there. You can see it, but that's an example of Art Deco. In 1949, NYU took over the lease for this building for 203 years. By the way, the leases for these buildings were typically 21 years with the possibility of renewal. But at any rate, NYU has continued to expand in this area, as I'm sure many of you know. But we're here. Where is this? We're here, right here. But around this time, Julia tells me that this particular photograph, which she was able to get, dates from right around mid-century. It's right around the time that NYU took this over, but you can see no dogs allowed, it says no trespassing, and this and that and the other. So there's certainly a sense of closure in this area. I don't know how well you can see this, but it's the best I can do. It's the only record that I know of this renovation. The building was renovated in 1951-52 for use as New York University classrooms. At that time, a mezzanine was built and two doors, and here's a door and here's a door that would have been along this facade. By the way, up to then, these windows were not open on this side. There would have been windows on this side. I think that that's something that Julia pointed out, and you can see that in the photographs. At any rate, this is from 1933, and you can see that tower skylight. Do you remember the rectangular I had pointed out? We were looking at this in that other photograph from this direction. And what happened, and you can see these closed windows. And what happened during this renovation in 1977 to bring this building then into, to prepare it for the opening of Deutsches Haus, an event, of course, that we're celebrating today. What happened was that back here, another story was added so that this was eliminated, although still you can see the skylight is there, and then a mansard roof was added. But also you can see at this point, which is, the photograph was taken while the conversion was going on. You can see the traces of those two doors. So at any rate, the 1977 renovation leads us to the story of Deutsches Haus and its wide embrace, to be recounted by Martin and Julia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia, for this introduction to the first 144 years. Indeed, in 1977, Deutsches Haus was opened, and if you go through the exhibition in the second floor, you'll see also images of this renovation. And we found those images in the archives of New York University. And Julia, there was a funny kind of, or a strange letter we found by NYU's archaeology department complaining to the architect of the renovation. And could you tell us that story?
Oh yeah, sure. So it was a really interesting account of a letter correspondence of the architect of the building. Actually, he was the architect of the renovation of Deutsches Haus, and his name was Roberto. And he, during the renovations, they found underneath the fundament of Deutsches Haus, they found remains of a cistern, a destroyed cistern. But interesting enough, Roberto told that story to campus. I think it was, I don't know if it was Washington Square News but a certain news outlet on campus. But he didn't tell the urban archaeologist department, and they immediately wrote the letter to him, as well as CCing the president at the time of NYU, and complaining why would that happen. And he justified, the architect justified himself in saying, well, we photographed the destroyed cistern as well as the bottle. They apparently found also bottles next to it, and I really tried hard to find any of these remains, but it was difficult. But what we found was, we really found the dias, or like the small slides, the slides of the photographs. And if you go upstairs, you indeed see the remains, like certain remains of a cistern that are still underneath where we're sitting right now.
So, Virginia, this destroyed cistern that was destroyed even more through the renovation, maybe, or not, and which must have been right underneath there. Must this have been a cistern of Randall's farm, the original farm?
I don't know, but I could add to that when the 1916 renovation was going on, one of the people who was involved wrote a letter. It's in the city files, trying to stop the renovation because of this, he called it a cesspool. And I don't know what happened, but he did draw, evidently he drew what appeared to be a wall. There's a little diagram that he made. That's all I know. And where it would have come, you believe that the diagram was not, I couldn't make out where the cistern was, but you believe that it would have been under here, and it makes sense to me.
It would be, I think, it would be in the back of this room, but it's also from the photographs of the renovations. So it's a good guess, and it's on the corner of this room. Yeah.
So we're now in 1977, which is when Deutsches Haus then opened. It was actually first called Goethe Haus, and it points to our ongoing relationship with the Goethe Institute in New York. So the Goethe Institute at that time was in Fifth Avenue, in the Upper East Side, and it made an agreement with NYU that NYU's Deutsches Haus, or NYU would start offering language courses to New Yorkers as a way of revenue for this new institution. The Maison Française had already been well established across Washington Mews. I don't remember from what time it is, but it must have been since the 60s or...
It was the early 60s.
I think it was earlier.
In any case, Maison Française was first. I think we need to point that out. And so basically Deutsches Haus was then called Goethe Haus at NYU, and then later in the early 80s was changed to Deutsches Haus, and offered basically from the very beginning what it is offering today. Language courses. Today we are the biggest language school in North America of German courses. We have over 1,000 students every year, and it offers a cultural and academic program, and did that ever since. And I think there was even a little theater company that produced regular theater performance of German theater, contemporary German theater as well, here at Deutsches Haus. And then there was a renovation in the 90s, an interior renovation of which you can see the remains here, and you can see how it looked like before in the 70s and 80s if you go upstairs on the second floor and see the old photographs. But I want to ask the two of you a question. I work here, and sometimes I have the feeling I live here because sometimes there's so much to do, so many exciting things to do. So my passion is understandable, this passion not just for the institution but for the building itself. But how do you explain your passion, not just for the building but for the entire area? What made you so interested in it?
Well, I have a long career, as you pointed out, as a sculptor. I was a sculptor for 25 years, and I was also taught sculpture with great pleasure to students at university. And I know how important space is to me. And I'm an expert on Gaston Lachaise, and the way to study him, and the way you study some of the American artists from the earlier part of the last century for whom records are just pieces here and there that you put together. For me, I try to put myself in the footsteps and trace these artists. And I actually, by the way, got that from my study of the Renaissance. I'm an expert on Florentine Renaissance sculptors as well, and I've done the same kind of research. I started to try to place myself where they were. If they're in one place, they're not in another place. It's simple as that. So at any rate, so two things. First of all, it's my way of researching, but secondly, my love of space. Space for me, as a sculptor, you manipulate space and light, and I would understand Lachaise, who's a great artist, would also be, when you look at his work and you know that that's what he's doing, so that you know what this space would have been to him. He was thrilled when he was able to rent it, and opened his own studio there. He called it one of the best in New York, and in writing to his wife and then to his stepson, he praised the space. He loved the space. So, and I do believe that an artwork is at its best in in the space in which it was created. I also, one other detail is anecdotal, but I had the great privilege of being the last student of Sir John Pennis. He was one of the great Renaissance sculptors, and when he retired and went to Florence, he said, "I'm happy to take these paintings home to the light and space in which they were created." So, I mean, that's also my feelings too. So anyway, I love space. I've been too long maybe on this, but I think all of us share this experience.
So, as you worked as a sculptor, and this space was primarily occupied by sculptures, right?
Yes, it was.
Do you think that there is something about this space, at least as it was, as an artist studio, that was particularly good for sculptors?
Yes, you can see them, the tower light. I mean, those were incredible. This huge space, this was very large space. And this was also not a living space. In my essay, I point out that when this was renovated, this building was renovated in 1916, there was an entrance to connect it to the building next door, which is where the artist would live. Now, that's not the case for Manship, who first took this space, lived next door with his family. Lachaise happened to live in hotels around town. He lived in the Brevoort and then also 1/5 and various places. He didn't live in this space.
Julia, you did such a fabulous job, I have to say it, with turning this into an exhibition. What attracted you about the topic?
Well, I think for me it was really the idea of like one, again, as Virginia said, like a space, but then creating a story to a space, because connecting just the many stories that happened in this place into an exhibition. And I think which is really interesting is to see like the variety and the richness of the stories and the histories that this place has experienced. And then thinking about this is only one building in the village, or in Greenwich Village around Washington Square, and how many like and has such a fascinating history and so many stories, and then expanding on that and thinking about how many different like places there are in the city and how many forgotten small historically important spaces there are that are interesting to explore. And I think so this was one really interesting aspect for me. And I think also the idea of telling history through stories and through not so much in a linear way, but through like a collection of stories was really interesting for me. And I think this was one of the ways I really wanted to carry that through.
Why don't you tell us one of those stories in the exhibition, the story of why Charlie Chaplin went in and out of this building?
Oh yeah. Well, I think it was really interesting to realize that it was really a place of encounter. And in one of the John Manship, the son of Paul Manship, the sculptor, recounts the story that Charlie Chaplin and Jack Dempsey were shadowboxing on the studio table here. So, and he says like the Manships were socially on the rise, and there were many people coming in and out, and there were many important social gatherings and probably big parties around here too. And I think this is really interesting to think of, like of the space also in that way. And also Deutsches Haus is also a place where people meet and people talk, and people gather and be creative. So I think this was a really great story. And then there's so many. The deeper you, and I think that was really rewarding for me. Is like the deeper you dig, the more there is, and the more there's. The more appreciation oneself has for all these little instances as well. I think, Virginia, you can speak about that too, right?
Well, yes, but one of the things I really liked about your work on the show is that you have such a splendid eye, and you really put the pieces together very beautifully to tell the story.
Oh, thank you. I think what I like to do is, first of all, it was really difficult for me to be like, okay, now I have to put a label underneath this photograph. It's like, how can I say something in like 3 lines that describes this well, that if a person looks at it, they will get the reward of it or whatever they want to have. And I think what I kind of like circumvented that was to have quotes. So like the most, like any quote I could find that would fit to that label, I would put underneath. So for example, the Charlie Chaplin story is with a quote of John Manship. And also the if you go upstairs, the story of John Barrymore, this idea of like, so Virginia and I found an interview of Reuben Nakian, who was the assistant of Paul Manship at the time in the 20s. And he tells the story, he tells in an oral interview the story that he brought the model, the plaster model of Paul Manship, of the bust of John, sorry, of the bust of John Barrymore, the bust of John Barrymore, he brings it up to his studio. And to John Barrymore. And I mean, John Barrymore at that time was a very famous actor, and he was very shy. He says he was extremely shy, and then Barrymore asks him whether he wants to go in a cab with him, and he was like, no. But he still gave him a $2 tip, and he Nakian says like he went back to the Mews, so to this place, and he said he had this tip. But Gaston Lachaise asked him, and he said, he quote. Wait,
you have to say he had a very expensive wife.
Yeah, and he said like in a very French accent, he says like, Rubin, can you lend me $2? And then he tells like that Gaston Lachaise's wife was always like he says nagging and spending the money. Well, we think probably not only her spent all the money, right? But spending the money, so he gave him the $2 that he just got from John Barrymore. And then we were so lucky enough to get the bust of John Barrymore, the original bust. The story was centered around. So I feel like, and it also really shows the atmosphere of that studio and like how people interacted and how open it was, because John Barrymore at that time also lived on 8th Street. So really everybody knew everybody. Yeah.
And that kind of spirit, of course, we hope has inspired Deutsches Haus as a place of openness, as a place of where people meet. Sometimes they're very famous as well. We've had the Nobel Prize winners here. Günter Grass, we show, was here on several occasions, and we document that in the exhibition. And of course, last year we had another Nobel Prize winner for literature, Hertha Müller, who was here. I would like to mention also one aspect of the exhibition that made me particularly happy, and that you found also documents about the garden, and you mentioned it in your presentation that the garden was actually a relative recent addition to this area, and it was designed as an Italian garden. And I think even though it changed, not all the elements of its original designs, like not all the pavilions are there, but I think it is still an incredibly beautiful place in New York. You can look out of it. I think whenever I show it to visitors from Europe, they can't believe that this is in the middle of Manhattan, and you have this oasis of tranquility with very beautiful pieces, not only the trees, the whole setup. It's just almost a magical place.
May I add to that?
Yes.
The studios, the stables, when they were converted to studios, were intended to open this way, so that you see the entrance is on the Mews, but you can see the windows. The front was thought to be facing the gardens, and the gardens were made at the very same time to inspire the artists when they became weary. That was what the Frank specifically said when he discussed his renovation.
And yeah, and sometimes people ask us, is this a public garden or is it not? And it is not a public garden. And I think that's in a way good, because it keeps the magic, the tranquility, and so on. But we do open it up occasionally. We ask all our neighbors for permission. We do that twice or 3 times a year. We have concerts then here or other events, and we ask all the neighbors. Since we've behaved well so far, they have not yet objected. What is your favorite area of this building? My own personal one is when it was a sandwich shop, of course, called Busy Bee, for that beautiful evocative name, Busy Bee. That's really. This is really
And you
my
have-
most inspiring title.
And you have to say it was all of the sandwiches were 3 cents each, right?
Right,
So therefore,
right.
that was also part of the.
Yeah, you would ask, could it get any cheaper? And it can get cheaper. Tonight we will offer you sandwiches again. We just thought we had to, and they will be for free. But what was your favorite period, Virginia?
I really loved the beautiful studio. I mean, that is the Murray photograph, I think, really says it all. A wonderful light-filled space. But I know that one of the things now is you've preserved some of that light-filled space, and you are again re-energizing the building.
We're not. We might one day convince you that this is the favorite period of
No, I have to say that I'm very bad in languages, but I did study. I studied German here in order to pass my exams. And I have to say, for a person, can I brag? I mean, I bragged a little bit already. I usually don't, but I did the best. The woman told me which is a miracle because I'm really bad at languages.
Fantastic. Maybe that's an inspiration.
So that's testament not to me. That's testament
to the language school. Yeah. The famous Swiss writer Max Frisch. He lived in New York on several occasions, and he had an American girlfriend, and wrote about that in several of his books. And he sent her to Deutsches Haus to take German courses. At least anecdotal evidence tells that. What was your favorite period?
It's really hard to decide. I think, I'm going to take a different route. I think it's not the favorite period, but I love how they each connect to each other, and like how you can think of a stable becoming an artist, becoming a Busy Bee sandwich shop, and then becoming an artist studio, and then becoming an art studio for students, and then becoming Deutsches Haus. And I feel like to have like all these different transitions all in one place, in just one building, is for me, I think, a really inspiring aspect of the exhibition. And also I want to say for the garden too, like there were really, I think what is really interesting with the garden and the whole house, and as Virginia already mentioned, is that really everything was built for like to be for the perfect environment for an artist to live or an artist to work. And I think the garden was also really like, at least it was regarded and it was spoken of like a place for contemplation and a place for inspiration. And all of this, and it was really considered a business opportunity to change this row of stable and this row of small shops into artist studios. And like this is probably one of my favorite quotes of the exhibition is in the New York Times in 1915. They say, "When will New York wake up to the fact that art pays better than business?" And it's 1916, right? And it's like, and again, as Virginia showed, like this transformation of like 5 years from horses and artists, and like kind of the radical artists moving into where the horses live, then turned right away into the well-off living here, and many artists having to move. And I think this is just one of these like really early instances of change that New York sees all the time, with like artists moving and always in different places. The really chic area, they were moving further northward and northward of New York. And this move, and so this area was, as Virginia said, it was a lot of furriers were around here, a lot of shops. It was a really like probably you can say like a working district.
But the townhouses, those townhouses were pretty much built in 1833, 1834, and they were, the leases from Sailor Snug Harbor stipulated that they had to be row houses. They had to fill the entire front of the lot. Mm-hmm. And they went up pretty soon. But then they declined and started to become used for commercial purposes towards the end of the 1800s.
For Sailor Snug Harbor, that really initiated that project too of creating artist studios. It was a move for revival of the area. Right. And yeah, please.
The one really important key feature of the renovation was that the will was changed a couple of years before 1916 to enable the Sailor Snug Harbor to either purchase, in other words, they leased the land. They did not build. Part of that initial lease for the land was that the tenants were, the leaseholders were obliged to, the first ones were obliged to build within 2 years. That's what it said. And they also had to follow certain strictures. They had to agree to do certain things. But at any rate, Sailor Snug Harbor was not able to build itself, number one. And it was not able to then purchase, they could purchase the properties under certain circumstances, but they could not improve the property themselves. So when that will was broken, the will was broken in stages. At that moment, when that stipulation was broken, immediately they started to then build this, renovate this large area. Mm-hmm. They were very wealthy. They honestly didn't need, I mean, I wouldn't say it honestly, but they didn't, it was not that they were lacking in money, but they were not earning what they ought to have been able to because the property was very, very valuable.
What about today, if you were to walk down Washington Mews towards Fifth Avenue, of the various townhouses other than the ones NYU has as centers, such as Deutsche Haus, Maison Francaise, and Africa House? If you were just to knock on the doors, what would you find? Tenants who are leaseholders, or just wonder what the current status is?
I mean, we do sometimes knock on the doors before we have events, because we want to make sure that there are no ugly surprises for our neighbors. And we find mostly NYU faculty, but also some of the buildings, I couldn't tell you now exactly which, are privately owned. So I would say NYU centers, they used to be, when I came to Deutsches Haus in 2011, the Ireland House at the corner, the Maison Francaise and us, and this has now changed in the last year. Our new neighbors, and there used to be Richard Sennett, the famous sociologist, used to live right here. But he moved out, and now our new neighbors are Africa House, a fantastic, very dynamic institution, and we have already done events together, and we're planning many more to come. And then there is the Asia Pacific Americas Center, and then there is the China House. Of course, China representing a very important field of interest for NYU. As you know, they're planning a campus in Shanghai. And so this is really turning into an international alley. And we had, on May 3rd, we had, some of you might have been able to come, we had, we all joined and teamed up, all the international houses, and we had a street fair where we invited independent booksellers to present their books. We did this in the context of the Penn Festival World Voices, and we had music, concerts on the street, artists on the street, a little puppet theater, which Deutsches Haus provided, and we had events in the international houses. And we want to do more of this. I think you mentioned this issue as this just being also another tale of gentrification. You know, the creative people come and into a decrepit area, and then they turn it into a beautiful area, but then they get kicked out because the rich people come in. And I think the contribution of NYU, even if it may be controversial in other areas and in other ways, we here at Deutsches Haus, and I think I can speak here for the international houses, we want to make sure that this area here remains a vibrant, or increasingly becomes more and more a vibrant area full of cultural activities. And I think we are starting, there's something very exciting is happening. And I think it is also happening because of the history of the spirit, of the genius loci, of not just Deutsches Haus, of all these places.
Well, yes, I think that, I mean, that's actually the theme of my book, was that this area was the locus for an extremely diverse community. And unlike, say, the 10th Street Studio, which was essentially for academics, male, but this was an incredible, and the history of it is that it's an incredibly diverse and vibrant community for a very long period of time.
The Deutsches Haus obviously has a political history as well as an architectural history. And there were times in the 20th century when the word Deutsch or German had to be pronounced in undertones. The nicest appellation of the Germans was Kartoffelfresser, and if you were caught eating sauerkraut, you better watch out. And I wonder what happened, I mean, of course, during World War I and World War II. Was there a period where the Nazi embassy tried to influence it?
Well, I mean, okay, the history of Deutsches Haus here at NYU starts in 1977. So the two world wars don't really enter into that. But it's interesting that there is another Deutsches Haus here in New York, and that's Columbia's Deutsches Haus, and we're very close with them as well. And they told me the story. Deutsches Haus, I mean, they were the first ones. We have to admit that.
They were then 21, I think, 1921.
No, actually, they were before the First World War. They opened up in 1911, Deutsches Haus. They created this name, and then they immediately closed in 1914 because of the First World War. And then they reopened in the 20s, and then they closed again in the Second World War. And then they opened up after the war, and they have a very beautiful space up on 116th Street. And we do work with them in the Festival Neue Literatur very closely, but it's more of an academic, I would say, an exclusively academic setting there. They have public events, but it's very closely associated, their events, with the German Department of Columbia University. One more aspect, you say, one has to say it in undertones, Deutsches Haus, or there were periods in the history. When we came here as a new team in 2011, we changed the logo of Deutsches Haus, and the logo before that was a very narrow D and H, and we thought, do people actually say, tonight I go to a DH event? And we realized, you say that, okay. Okay, well, had we met you at that, we might have taken a different course, but we thought New Yorkers actually really liked to say Deutsches Haus. We encountered that. People, they really like it, to pronounce it, and they're proud to pronounce it. So we thought, we went a course of saying, no, actually we want a design which is really into your face, Deutsches Haus, spelled out in capital letters, and in the Bauhaus tradition. And of course, that's also the tradition, the letters over the door were from the very beginning. So it's really this Bauhaus, a very clean, very classical design in capital letters. Any more questions?
I guess we can only hope that in 2152 NYU's lease will be renewed.
At a certain moment, sometime, I forget when it was, between 1976 and 1984, NYU bought almost all of this. You see, but that was again another breaking of the will. It was broken in stages. At first, there was the long lease of this building and others for 203 years. That was starting in 1949. But then, again, the will was broken, so that during that period of time, that entire area that I showed you on that map was sold.
Yeah, say listener, Carver doesn't, they told us they currently don't have any more property around this area anymore, except 1 Fifth Avenue, right? Yeah, yeah.
But to give you just an idea how really far we went, Julia really went to Sailors Neck Harbors, and we befriended them, and they came here, the entire board, and we're really happy about this exhibition, and we're going to explore ways of doing events with them and look at their mission, which is to provide, I think is a fascinating institution as well. They provide seafarers, seamen that have, and I'm quoting them, right, who are old and...
Yeah, for, excuse me?
I think that's worn out.
Worn
Yeah,
out.
old and worn out. And who are in some ways in trouble, and they help them, and they still do that up till now. So we were talking that we might do an event together with seamen,
We were
whether
thinking of-
worn out or not, and listen to their stories, because I think there's a myth surrounding seamen and their tales and their stories, and New York is a harbor, and that's a way to connect to Germany as well. And so we're preparing something together with Sailors Snug Harbor, who were the owners for many, many decades of this property.
But they're down now, actually, they're down in South Carolina.
No, they moved back.
Yeah, to Staten
Yeah,
Island.
they moved. Well, Staten Island, the property still belongs to them, but there's no more home, no more retirement home, or at least like currently working there.
But the office is there.
But the offices, they moved back the offices to New York City now.
But there's no sailors then, I guess?
In North Carolina, no. Well, I think they maybe have some archives left, but they moved. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I would like to know when the arched brick entrances to the sidewalks of the Mews were built. I noticed they're not in the earlier photographs. And did their building coincide with the locking of the street at night, or was that done earlier?
Christopher Gray wrote a wonderful article on the history of the gate. He's the very famous architectural historian who used to have articles in the New York Times, but he's still around. What was it, 1984, was it, that the article on the gates?
Yes,
But he doesn't give the dates, and I've tried to establish dates myself as well for dating photographs. But if you notice some of them with a little tower, we can say that those were dating from 1916 renovation up until after around 1950.
Yeah.
When they became the gates that they are today, I'm not really sure. But you'll notice in some of the earlier photographs of those gates during the period of time after as they were from the 1916 renovation, some of them will have a tile on them. And the tiles the buildings were streamlined to some extent in the 30s to make some of the details were sort of smushed over to make the buildings more agreeable to current taste, more streamlined 1930s taste. But Christopher Gray points out the history, but the gates over there with the chains and the ones here. You'll see in some of the earlier ones, the gates were metal lines. You'll see them in the show. I can only point to his article and to say that I've tried to establish the dates, and I've given you what I myself have been able to establish.
Yeah, I think the metal gates, at least that's what we see, were up to the renovation in 1916, and at some point there were also no gates, as you did the very early photographs onwards. But in 1916 there were the brick gates. Oh, actually there were the white gates with exactly as Virginia mentioned, the tiles on. And what was interesting in that article also, they said that the Mews were one of the last streets of New York that had still gas lamps in 1939, right?
They also had them in the alley, and then they turned them off during World War II, and then they removed them.
Okay, yeah.
But you see on relatively recent photographs, you still see these gas lamps, right, on the old gates, before the brick gates, right?
Yeah, I think so, right? Yes, exactly.
The ones that you see now.
Yeah.
That cartoon, the 1921 cartoon about driving the artists out. You'll see those little lamps. I mean, that was very. They named the building, which corresponds to this building. What was it? 40, yeah. But it's really 42, and they had all the identifiers, the window boxes, the tiles, and you'll see. Right then, the gates that we're discussing that were made in 1916 with those lamps and with the little tiles on them too. I mean, so absolutely that cartoon was about what you see right around here.
What is special about this Mews is not that the buildings have great spaces, because as an architect I would say they're not great spaces. It's not great architecture here either. What is amazing is that it is so totally different from the tough, big powerful city around it, that you come upon it and you cannot believe that you're here. It's truly magical from that point of view. So my question is this. NYU owns it, terrific, but is it landmarked? So they cannot pull it down to build bigger, more efficient buildings?
I'm not familiar with the entire landmark regulations, but I can tell you that I'm familiar with some, and they're sometimes quite surprising. When last year NYU renovated Washington Mews, it had to take out the stones in order to put pipes there, and to renew also the pipes underneath. And it had to use the exact same bricks and put them back together again. But what it also wanted to do was to have the whole street covered with these cobblestones. And Landmark didn't allow that. So the last part, if you go towards Fifth Avenue, is concrete, and it always was concrete. So Landmark said, no, you just can't put cobblestones in there. And then apparently, at least that's what we've been told by NYU, Landmark also said that the trees need to be cut down. And so the trees in front of Deutsches Haus and in front of La Maison Française, which I think were very, very beautiful, and I miss them. They were actually cut down not because NYU wanted it, but because Landmark wanted it. So, there's sometimes, I think it's very good that these buildings are landmarked and that they're protected. We're very happy about it, and there are very strict regulations. We're going to be renovated next year. NYU has included us in their plan and the facade, and already we've had first talks about, and Landmark is a continuous issue and topic, and it has to be done exactly according to historical standards.
And also, like, the building itself became a landmark building together with the opening of Deutsches Haus, just before Deutsches Haus was opened. And as Virginia said, like the photograph you saw with the entrances on University Place, I assume they had to change that regarding going back to the landmark status, or to get the landmark status and revert back to 1916. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the process at that moment. All I can do is just present you with the visual evidence that I've been able to dig up.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm exactly, because they were celebrating both the landmark, designation, the landmark designation of the building, and then the opening of Deutsches Haus. So, and I think a lot of the renovations that went on here were in mind of landmark, becoming a landmark.
I've dug through the records downtown, and there's nothing that's specific about. Actually, some of the details I've shown you are not really discussed, so they're incomplete.
They have to decide what period they want to maintain it to.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting, imagine it would be Busy Bee, right? That little shape. Yeah, and be like, so this is Deutsches Haus now.
If there aren't any more questions, I would say Busy Bee is the conclusion. We need to go back to the sandwiches, which we're going to present to you now. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Virginia. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much. Thank you. And have a wonderful evening and enjoy the show.